It's Devin Nunes. My project was on the air quality in Japan. Japan's air quality is amongst the worst in the world. Industrial emissions, automobile emissions, and geographical location makes Japan much more susceptible to pollution. Japan's located right outside of China, to the east of China, so pretty much everything from China blows over to Japan. So Japan's got to worry about their own problems plus China's problems. So it really makes for a bad situation for the people in Japan. Little history of Japan's pollution. Environmental pollution in Japan caused from industrialization first began in the Meiji period, 1868 to 1912. Pictured here is a real old factory that's not no longer used. That's going to be taken down soon in Japan. In the 1960s, it's when they first had diseases caused by factory emitted water and air pollution in areas throughout Japan. There was reports of cases prior to that, but there wasn't anything that was really serious going on. Due to Japan's lax of restrictions on industrial emissions, Japan suffers from a serious amount of pollution. In this picture, we got two guys jogging in front of a picture, and they want to stop and take a picture. And it's Japan Bay before the pollution, and it's covering up Japan Bay with all the pollution on it. And it just goes to show what they're doing to their country from industrial emissions. A big part in Japan's industrial emission problem is what comes from China. Japan's so close to China, they're pretty much first in line to catch air masses or big smog clouds from China. So anything that Japan does, they have to deal with their own stuff, and then they also have to deal with what China's doing. So right now, with both countries having very little to none laws on industrial emissions and pollution, it's just really tearing Japan up. Mostly the western side of Japan. It's pretty much evident if Japan doesn't start to make serious changes in their industrial emission laws and regulations, they're just going to continue to battle poor air quality. They also need China to get on board with them and do the same thing, and hopefully they can start to repair and fix the problems that they've created after decades of little to no laws whatsoever on industrial emissions. Another leading contributor in Japan's poor air quality is automobile emissions. In this picture, you've got one of the most common vehicles in Japan. It's a diesel truck. There's a lot of working class citizens in Japan that use these type of trucks or little diesel powered scooters to get around the city. There's a lot of people in Japan, a lot of people using these vehicles that are just tearing our ozone up and really creating a bad environment for their own people in their own country. Japan's lax of rules on automobile emissions, the same as the industrial emissions, allow citizens to drive outdated, cheap vehicles. So, in this picture, you'll see all the diesel trucks down there, all the big looking trucks, and then most of those cars are all ran on diesel. Everything there is subpar to what's over here because everything over there has less laws. They don't have to pass so many restrictions and laws, so the companies make worse vehicles that are worse on the environment because they can get away with making it over there and selling it for cheap. And so pretty much everybody over there is using these diesel powered vehicles and just creating a really bad environment for themselves and for the whole world. Japan's air quality is a real big problem for them, but it's also affecting us. But on a positive note, in 2002, finally legislation was passed to improve the rules and attempt to cut back at vehicle emissions. Uh, they currently are doing truck checks where they pull over the diesel powered trucks and they've got to pass certain tests in order to pretty much continue driving, they'll get a ticket, or they could have their vehicle towed if they're still operating the diesel powered engines that are really, really harmful on their environment and on their air quality. So the laws that they started to make in 2002 weren't quite really making a difference. So in 2003, they made the laws a little bit more stricter as they continue to fight the automobile emission problems. In this picture, you'll see a lot of people riding bicycles now, and there's more electric powered scooters. They're trying to go green and really cut back on the automobile emissions. So they have a lot less diesel powered trucks, cars, vans, anything. Everything is getting to be a little bit more modernized as they continue to tighten and work on fixing their laws and making everything safe for everyone. So here's the geographical location issues. Japan sits east off China's coast, so a majority of Japan's air pollution gets carried from China. So if you look in the picture, China's everything in the purple, and then Japan is right to the east of that. Everything that China does carries over from sea breeze and gets carried into Japan. So everything China's doing is affecting Japan in a negative way. So Western Japan is really tore up, and I'll get into detail with that later in the presentation. One of the leading issues is the air masses or the smog bubbles that will carry over from from China to Japan. Japan will never be able to fully combat the air quality problem until China cuts back on its own industrial emissions. In this picture, you'll see a big, nasty looking cloud, and all that is pollution just coming over. Uh, Through sea breeze, most of the pollution will carry over from China. What happens is the wind comes in from the water, and it'll pick up everything, and then it'll go back out to the sea. And since Japan's so close, right there off the coast, it'll wash up on the Japan, and it'll carry over as acid rain or smog bubbles, and it'll tear everything up that it pretty much comes across. It'll tear up people's respiratory systems, and it'll tear up their environment. We're going to talk about Western Japan in the next few slides. Pretty much, Western Japan is the closest area of Japan to China. It's the most polluted part of Japan. So all these areas in this little picture here are some of the worst areas in Japan. That's where all the pictures of people wearing face masks and all that kind of stuff comes from. Uh, there's a few places not listed in this picture, but that's just a few of them to give you an example. The Kanto Plain is known for having the biggest source of air pollution in Japan. It doesn't matter what season it is. They've got some pretty. It's a pretty big area that's got a lot of people in it. It's got a lot of plants, and it's pretty close to China. So, Kanto Plain throughout the year is gonna have worse pollution than any other location. Here's just a quick little slide to give you an example of what acid rain is for those of you that don't know. Um, Pretty much you'll see emissions from the vehicles, emissions from the trucks, and the plants. They go into the clouds, and then they make small clouds and everything else, and it turns into precipitation. Then it falls down onto the environment or on the people, and it tears up the environment. It tears up concrete. It tears up a lot of stuff. So all that stuff is really seriously affecting Western Japan, and it's not just Japan. A lot of it's China also, but Western Japan's really taking a beating from a lot of acid rain and acid snow. So here's just a little quick slide. So once again, talking about the acid rain damage on Western Japan, there's been many studies that show the majority of the forests along the western facing mountain slopes have been severely damaged by the amount of acidic snowfall. In the picture, it shows acid rain damage, but it's pretty much going to look the same way. Acid snowfall is going to do the same thing as acid rain, and all it does is it just pretty much eats up the vegetation and all the life that is on the mountains, and it kills a lot of the stuff that you know Japan needs to help uh, purify the air. Without any trees, without any wildlife, you're not it's gonna you're gonna have a hard time getting oxygen. And then when you've got all the emissions on top of that, it makes it really hard for anybody to breathe. And there's a lot of respiratory issues with people in Japan, like asthma and polynesis and all that kind of stuff. We'll talk about that later in the slide, but just a little example of what acid rain damage looks like here on that mountain slope there. Winter in Japan's pretty bad. It's not the worst season, but uh, anytime you're in Japan, it's during the winter. Your air pollution is going to be most problematic on a cold, clear, still night after the sun sets because many of the air pollutants begin to accumulate near the ground and surface where there's no wind present. You'll see here in this picture, they've got guys that are running a 5K marathon, and most of them's got gas masks on or face masks on because you can't breathe. And they're running, closer towards the night, and you can tell it's cold because they've got on long sleeve stuff. It's probably been raining, and it just makes it really hard to live an everyday life like you would here in America because you can't breathe. So, just a little picture for an example. And spring in Western Japan has a lot less airflow from China, so generally the air pollution is going to be really low, a lot lower than what it is the rest of the seasons, except in the Kanto Plain District, which it just sucks there year round. So springs where you want to go visit is when you want to go visit Japan, unless you have bad sinus problems, because um, we'll get on that subject with the next slide. But there's a lot more pollen in the air during the spring. So as I mentioned before, during the spring there's a lot more pollen in the air. There's a little picture there of just some pollen off of a tree. There's a lot of forest in Japan, and a lot of pollen and a lot of stuff like that. So it's always it's gonna be really hard to breathe whenever you've got your industrial emissions, you've got your automobile emissions, and then you've got pollen on top of that going into your lungs. So there's a lot of problems with polynesis, a lot of problems with asthma to get people that live in Japan year round. Summer in Japan, there's normally low to medium levels of air pollution, but if there's no wind, you're likely to get a buildup of smog if you're located in a valley. So pretty much, if you're in Kanto Plain District, then it's gonna suck. But the rest of it shouldn't be too bad. Just as long as you're not in a valley and you're not in Western Japan. If you're on Eastern Japan, then you really won't have to worry about much. But in this picture is just some evidence of pollution and what acid rain and humans can do to a forest. Here's a little clip shows what sea breeze does. I mentioned it earlier, talking about the pollution coming from China. If you look into the picture, you'll see that the sea breeze comes in, picks up all the pollution from the land, rises the warm air up into the clouds, then it goes back out to sea, and then it goes into the ocean and descends. Well, since China's a stone away from, or since Japan's a stone away from China, all that pollution just washes out the sea, and then it just hits Western Japan. But the good thing is it also works the other way, and some of it will wash back off from Japan into the ocean. But it's a double-bladed sword because the emissions are so bad and so out of whack there that it's just a constant battle. Um, During the summer, it's going to recycle out a lot of the pollution, the same as it does in other coastline locations around the world. So during the fall, air pollution in Japan begins to increase as winter approaches. The sea breeze becomes less common with each passing week. So pretty much, winter's coming and there's not as much sea breeze to help recycle out the pollution. and during the fall, it's going to start getting pretty bad on your respiratory system and getting pretty bad on just as far as being able to breathe. Period. If you're in Japan, so you can imagine how hard it is for these people to live in this country year round, where you pretty much just can't breathe. You can't do anything. It's hard to function. But during the night at fall in Japan, it's not too bad because the atmosphere is a little bit more stable, and the pollutants from all the emissions that are close to the ground gets trapped, and they rise higher. So it's a lot easier to breathe, and it's a lot easier to do things because you don't have everything on top of you. It's all getting up into the atmosphere, and it's bad for our atmosphere. It's bad for us globally. But as far as being in Japan, it's a little bit easier to breathe at nighttime in the fall. As I mentioned before, Eastern Japan doesn't suffer from hardly the amount of pollution Western Japan suffers year round. Of course, they've got their automobile emissions, but they don't have the impact China has on them, and they don't have to worry about as many plants because most of it's in Western Japan. So you'll see there's a picture of Eastern Japan, pretty much no smog. Uh, it looks like any other country or any other city. As I mentioned before, pollinosis and asthma are two major issues for citizens of Japan due to poor air quality. In the picture here, you'll see a normal airway, and you'll tell where the muscle is not constricted on the lining, so the air can flow pretty freely there. And if you look at the one with asthma, the muscle is wrapped all the way around the lining, and it's really tight, and it's causing swelling, and you can't get airway through there because it's so tight and wrapped up, and you got mucus in there. So pretty much the dude on the right is what you got to deal with every day in Japan because of their poor choices and on their careless acts of their emissions from automobiles and everything else. Something I didn't really go into detail in this PowerPoint about is the cedar trees. The cedar trees is the main cause of pollinosis and asthma-related diseases in Japan. The trees are common throughout the forest of Japan, especially where the mountains are at. The pollen it produces is particularly small. Japan does have a few efforts at going green. They get credit with a lot of effort in reducing forms of pollution here recently, but on the other hand, they do mess a lot of the regular environment up in a number of areas, and not forging a coherent long-term environmental policy really causes a lot of stir with within Japan and within Japan on the international level, how they're viewed as a country. And we'll talk about as far as what they do to their ecosystems and everything else in a little bit later. So pretty much, there's been several surveys that shows that all of Japan's only 7% of Japan's sandy beaches are natural. So this is pretty much what I was referring to in the last slide, where they don't have natural beaches. They don't have natural habitat. It's all things that's been man-made, and it's been altered in some way to benefit humans or from human activity. So in the picture there is just an example of a man-made beach. None of that's real. That was all human-made, and it looks pretty, but it's really bad for the environment. It's really bad for the ecosystem. It really messes things up. And Japan's got the majority of their beaches and their habitat in the water is man-made. But in the early 2000s, Japan has really started to wake up a little bit. They're really trying to go green. In October 2009, a court in Hiroshima ruled against a shore project that would have involved reclaiming land to build a new bridge and roads on the inland sea. They did that because they believe that the scenic beauty had precedence over the public needs, which it's true. You care more about the way something looks, but also you care about what's going to be better for their quality of living and for your atmosphere and your ecosystem. So they're on the right path. It's just going to take a long time to fix what they've messed up and teach their future generations of tomorrow how to go green. In this picture, you'll see they're really getting a lot more of the electric cars, and they're going away from the diesel engines. And hopefully, in the near future, they'll have a lot less automobile emissions and begin to work on their industrial emissions. So hopefully you learned from this PowerPoint that Japan does have a pretty serious problem with their air quality. It's the majority of it's based off of human interactions and human activity. But hopefully they continue to take the steps they need to take in the future to go green and make everything safer for themselves and repair what they've done. Um, but don't forget that some of it is off of their geographical location, like the cedar trees and whatnot. But here's the sources that was used to make this slide and get most of the information. Thanks for listening.